Good morning, colleagues.
Morning, Dr. Jangis Likai.
Ke teng ntate le kae ntate?
Re teng rara.
Ke re ke bone hore ke a bonala sentle, la ka utlwala
O
sentle.
bonela o tlhamaletse rara o bonela
Right.
sentle.
Ke tlhapile sentle.
O tlhapile sentle.
No,
Ane
ke
re tla re o eme motwenene.
no, ke a leboha, right. Thank you so much.
Okay, my brother.
Sure, bye.
Recording in progress.
Good morning, honorable members. I think it's 9 o'clock or just thereabouts, 9:01. May I welcome everybody. I think we need to begin the meeting. I want to, let me just quickly just double check which honorable members are here. And I don't want to run a register, but I can see Honorable Burke. Perhaps it's helpful to switch on your video. This way we can see you.
Morning, Chair, and morning, colleagues.
Morning, Honorable Burke. Honorable Douglas is here. I see. Looking regal as usual. I see Honorable Wakelin is here.
Good morning, Chair.
And then Honorable Kwankwa is here. Well, welcome, Honorable Kwankwa. Those are the ones I can see.
Yeah, I'm here, Tata, but having connectivity issues, I'll open the video now.
Perfect. And then Honorable Kalega Mazibuko and Honorable Bartlett are both here. Honorable Bartlett, you're on mute.
Okay, Chair.
Morning,
Yeah, but I'm going to
members.
switch off the middle. Okay.
Goeiemorgen. I see
Goeiemorgen.
you are missing Honorable Flonyani in your EFF colors there, but I'm going to leave that to the new GNU. I'll leave it to that.
Okay, Chair. As well as grade 12s.
Let me, I don't see any other honorable members unless they're here. If Honorable Flonyani is here, I know she's been out for a while, but I think with that in mind, the meeting is quorate. Honorable members, it's the purpose behind this meeting is to do work in preparation for the midterm budget policy statement. We will deal with allocations towards the announcements towards the end. The agenda is fairly straightforward. We have a presentation by PBO, and then we'll have deliberation post that. There are no additional items put on the agenda. With that in mind, may I ask, is there a mover for the adoption of the agenda?
I move, Honorable Chair.
I move second.
I support.
Seconded by Honorable Douglas. With the agenda being adopted, may I ask honorable members, it is perfectly fine if I can request just that when the presentation is being done, we can have our videos off. But if we make inputs, if we can make our videos on, this way it will be helpful so that we have a conversation there. It's often quite tricky to manage virtual meetings because there are multiple things that are of consideration, especially when presentations are going. When your hand goes up and I don't see it, please feel free to just unmute and then just indicate your desire to make input, comments, or questions. And then that way we will go through the presentation, which is quite a substantive presentation. When I read through it under Mr. Janji's, Dr. Janji's, because there are a number of aspects that go into the MTBPS, and therefore, given that for many members in this particular committee, it's a first in MTBPS, I want to allow you, given that there are also legislative components that are put in the presentation or emanating from the Money Bills Act and that come to this particular committee. So I want the committee to be as well prepared as possible going into next week's marathon run. So may I, with that in mind, give you the floor and allow you the space to then take us through the presentation you have prepared. Welcome, Honorable Dr. Janchis, and welcome to all the other members of the PBO. We are always appreciative. I've already got a number of questions myself, but I will leave you to go so that when the fight begins, let it begin after you have spoken. Over to you, Dr. Janchis.
Good morning, Chair and members and colleagues. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And Chair and members, that's the purpose of this presentation, to really give members some context, but some of the issues that to take into account in really, preparing for the first medium-term budget policy statement for this current administration. So thank you so much. We're privileged that you've made time for us to present with you this. We also, as one of workshop, also bring members into space, some expectations and so on. So we really appreciate that this opportunity, Chair members. I'm with the team on the platform. We, as many of us, will take you through this presentation. We'll try to keep to certain areas, but of course, we really like this presentation to create more discussions as a build up to the statement by the Minister of Finance next week. The outline, Mapula is sharing the slides, so I'll do some few remarks at the beginning and look at the introduction slides, and then I'll come back to allow colleagues to take us through. Next slide. So our outline, Chair and members, is really to provide context, particularly where we look at the policy issues that are in place, but also the framework from which we expect the policy state to be built on, but also provide a context where we are in terms of the spending and areas of revenue, and also highlight some of the understanding, some of the issues around what has been the previous committee's proposals on proposing the changes to be made on allocation, and how, in our view, we suggest the process to be taken forward in this regard. Next slide, colleagues. I think the first issue, we also want to clarify that the importance of this, we want to really provide a context, economic context, social context, public finance context, from which the statement will be presented on next week, Thursday. But remind ourselves and members is that this is a legislative process of money bills, an amendment Procedures Act that Minister of Finance has to present this post statement 3 months before the presentation of the main budget in the year. So this is very in line with the Act, as the Chair was saying. So really the policy statement, provides a very revised framework for the current year and outlines the proposal for the next MTF cycle. And what we did in this presentation, Chair, is just to quickly remind members and highlight members what are some of the specific priorities or specific responsibilities of these 4 committees. And the issue around fiscal framework really focus on macroeconomic outlook situations and really the fiscal as a whole, which in terms of the Money Bills Act is the finance committees who are required to report on this in the houses. And it further looks at the spending priorities focus for the next MTF cycle, and proposes some of how the revenue will be allocated within the 3 spheres, and focuses also on some of the specific changes to be made in the conditional grants. And all these 3 instruments are the responsibilities of these committees of appropriations, and the reports, they have to report on these areas. As I mentioned earlier, we want to really cover, provide context of global economic situation and our country's economic situation, from which obviously there are risks that we want to flag, we expect to reflect, which are impacting on our economy, but also impacting on how public finance develops. But I think more importantly, really looking at how issues around cost of living and how other these risks impacting our households and our economy, and how the role of budget can be used to improve on some of these areas. And also, one of the areas that we do, we often focus a lot on the policy which the budget is presented and how this works hand in hand. And I think we highlight some of the key risks and areas of concerns that the court should take into account going into these discussions. The next slide, Mapula. In this slide, all right. Am I audible, Mapula? Is it me? Maybe it's me.
We can hear you.
All right. Okay. I think the slides are first, but in the meantime, while they prepare them, Siraj, what's going on with the slides? So in the next slide, really, thank you so much. Thanks. The approach of how we view the budget has to be recognized and seen is really in a way where there's a clear linkage between what the budget, what the policy priorities are, and what the budget says has to be used for those priorities. So that's really an important determination at the beginning of understanding the budget process and framework. As I said, as the policy system provides some of these, planning priorities over the next few years, that has to be based a lot on the strategic framework of what government has achieved over the next term or so. So I think we've heard a lot about midterm development plan. Normally, in the previous years, we had medium-term strategic framework. So we're saying, emphasizing the importance of understanding that framework to say we should provide the medium-term development plan should provide a clear long-term strategic framework for which the government's priorities will be laid out, from which the budget has to be, budget framework has to fit into those over realizing those goals over time. But I think what we want to highlight on this slide is that where we are at this stage, we have yet to see a tabling of this medium-term development plan as just to articulate the priorities of the term. So if we don't have that plan, our concerns which we want to bring to these committees and Parliament as a whole is how then, if we don't have a plan that's set out long-term strategic framework, Parliament can effectively really approve this policy statement without a very clear guidance in terms of what this budget framework has to fit in. It's a very important question in our view. We have to grapple with because we don't have a tabled midterm development plan as this yet. Yet we're seeing the policy statement being tabled in weeks to come. Next slide. And I think it really comes to a point where we say the robust midterm development plan is essential and crucial for Parliament to exercise effective oversight over this policy statement that we presented, or particularly over the framework of the budget, because our approach, our view is that the budget has to be seen within the priorities that has to be achieved, but without this priorities being set out clearly, how are we going to have oversight effectively done by Parliament? Without this plan, it becomes difficult to assess whether there is a better alignment between long-term strategic development goals and the budget itself. And I think it's a very interesting debate that we want to bring to this committee as a very context towards preparation for the discussion of policy statement itself. Members should be concerned about the disconnect between the plan itself, and the potential disconnect between the budget framework and the plan itself if we don't have it at this stage. Approving the MTBPS without this finalized strategic plan really risks the issue of misalignment between the budget and the policy plans, which has been an issue that we've raised over time. But also when you've seen how budget has been built up over the years, we've seen quite a growing divergence between the two. Now we are very concerned that already we are seeing policy statement being presented without this plan being presented, and we're concerned that it could lead to better, more structured misalignment between the two. And in our view, this what would be the important starting point of discussion with the government as part of the oversight in this regard. I'll stop here, Chair, and allow Dr. Olani to take us through, and the other colleagues will come through. Thank you so much. Nelia, take us through. Thank you.
Thank you to Ms. Sani. Next slide, please. And good morning, honourable members and chairperson. The next few slides will just is to illustrate how the implementation of the NDP actually evolved over time. This diagram is showing the first implementation plan for the NDP, the 2014 to 2019 MTSF. And you can see initially we had 14 outcomes, and it has been arranged in terms of the real focus of the National Development Plan, which is a decent standard of living for all South Africans through the elimination of poverty and reduction of inequality, which remains until today. And then we'll just see on top outcome 11 and outcome 12 at the bottom. Those are the two overarching outcomes that has been identified, and both of them still remains. Next slide. So the next medium-term strategic framework, it was for 2019, and currently it actually were reduced to 7 priority areas, and you can see it's also been arranged in terms of the focus of the NTB, is in terms of growing the economy, to reduce inequality, to ensure investment, and also to create employment. And then the 2 overarching ones, priority areas, remain for this current 5-year period. Next slide. So in terms of the priorities for the next 5 years, it has been reduced or consolidated into 3 priority areas, which are the inclusive growth and job creation, reducing poverty, and tackling the high cost of living, and also building a capable, ethical, and developmental state. And the National Planning Commission advisory on the new medium-term strategic framework actually recommends reforms that are capable of execution within the medium term. Another reform that they actually recommend is that they will choose the most significant impact, considering data and evidence, which are the 2 most important things that they actually recommend. And then another reform is that will accelerate the developmental objectives of the NDP. So reforms will have to happen to be able to implement the last 5 years of the National Development Plan. Next slide. Members, because of that we don't have the new medium-term strategic framework, or which is now changed to the medium-term development plan, I've just tried to arrange the chapters of the NDP within the 3 priorities that has been identified by the presidency, and also to try and link it to the budget. And you can see on the right-hand side are the budget functional classification groups. It's just trying to see how we can actually link the budget, and if we want to monitor the implementation of the plan in terms of the expenditure, this might be a possible arrangement within the medium-term development plan that we are still waiting. Next slide. So members, we also added this slide just to indicate how the DPME actually can assist this committee with monitoring the implementation of the plan. So with the induction program that you had, the DPME actually made a lot of commitments, and they indicated also that they are currently busy with the coordination of the development of the medium-term development plan, which previously was the MTSF. The plan will provide the platform for the NDP implementation and the translation of national priorities into the budget framework, as well as sectoral and institutional plans. Once the plan is adopted, DPME will develop the budget prioritization framework, which should be reflected in the 2024 MTBPS. So that is something that we need to watch out for, whether it is actually included in the medium-term budget policy statement that will be tabled by the end of the month. The budget framework is developed on an annual basis, or it should be developed on an annual basis. With previous experience, we haven't seen that framework, but it should identify the policy and planning priorities for the forthcoming year and utilize to guide resource allocations in line with short, medium, and long-term priorities. Monitoring, evaluation, and research reports capture progress being made and challenges experienced in achieving government priorities as encapsulated in the NDP, or the Medium-Term Development Plan. So this was a commitment that the DPME made with your planning session that you had. And it's really, we should regularly, they must come and present to this committee, and it will assist this committee to monitor and implementation the implementation of the NDP. And as part of the planning function, DPME assess strategic plans and annual performance plans of national and provincial departments to ensure alignment with the Medium-Term Development Plan, NDP, and National Spatial Development. Those reports are also crucial for this committee to ensure that we have credible annual performance plans that actually reflect the Medium-Term Development Plan outputs. Next slide. Thank you, members. My next colleague will continue.
Okay, good morning, honorable members and chair. I'll take you through the economics section of the presentation. We start with the global outlook. So starting with the short term, we see that global growth forecasts remain below the pre-COVID-19 pandemic annual average of 3.2%, which was for the decade 2010 to 2019. And if we look at the world, we see for 2024, they're estimating 2.6, and going forward, 2.7 for 2026. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that this level of growth, global growth, is very close to the kind of warning of a global recession number, which is 2.5%. So we're not seeing a huge recovery and a possibly robust recovery. And one of the problems with the robustness is that uncertainty remains high because of what's become termed the polycrisis, the multiple interrelated global economic risks to the global economy. These include global climate change events, which have become more severe, but also more regular as the normal climate events become affected by changes in global climate. We're seeing changes in the possibilities of the major currents through the Atlantic and other oceans, changes that could have significant changes in where rainfall happens, droughts happen, and we've seen more disasters in South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal particularly, but also across the world. We see intensifying and scary geopolitical conflicts, but also within countries, increasing domestic conflict and civil strife and things, rising inequality, the possibility of future pandemics, cost of living crisis, and I don't have it down here, but the possibility of financial crises. And we see, for instance, the interrelatedness of these events is that the geopolitical problems have been associated with rising prices, problems in global value chains, that then cause stress on businesses and the abilities to pay for finance. We've seen the climate change events causing huge losses, problems with the insurance industry, but also with people losing their properties and being able to service their debts, etc. So we're seeing the possibility also of increased financial problems. And as governments have to step in, sovereign debt levels are really high, and there's worry about several developing countries having debt problems and possibly defaulting, and with these kind of interrelated issues, that becomes even more of a concern. We have seen in the short term that global growth has reignited as central banks have reduced interest rates. But as I said, these are really small amounts, 0.1%, 0.2% over the last 2 years and in forecasts. And the intensified geopolitical conflict and climate disasters could easily lead to inflationary pressures, as I said. Next slide, please. Thanks, Mapula. So what I decided to do is, because we always focus and the MTBPS, the budget reviews, even the IMF and World Bank economic outlooks and documents focus on the short term. I thought that, given that this is a workshop, we should also talk about the longer term trends and what's happened within the global economy affecting growth patterns. And we see that the current performance and outlook for the global economy reflects the long-term trends across country groups, much of which can be attributed to macroeconomic and finance policies. And I think it's important to understand this longer-term trend. In the graph, I've actually put in a lot of the financial problems, debt crisis and financial crisis that we see have added to the volatility, but also, I think, contributed to the long-term decline in global growth. And so we see since the 60s, there's been a fairly clear decline in global GDP growth. Next slide, please. So in interpreting what's happened, I think an important relationship between the crises in financial markets that we've seen has been in the 90s neoliberal ideological shift that led to change from focusing on full employment as the main goal of macro policy to focusing on inflation and government budget deficits, keeping budget deficits low. Linked to this, there was also a severe push for increased liberalization of domestic financial markets, but also cross-border international capital flows. The adoption of these growth and development constraining neoliberal fiscal and monetary policies in developed countries and the imposition on Africa and Latin America, particularly with the structural adjustment programs in the 80s, was an important reason for poor global growth at a period when growth accelerated in China and India. The liberalization of financial markets within countries and cross-border financial flows have had important negative impacts on stability and growth since the 1980s, with increased international flows of short-term, what we often refer to as hot money, speculative, moving across borders, causing speculative booms and bust, financial crises, and contagion. And often we see that monetary policy particularly is affected and has to react to these changes, the movements of money into and out of countries, or even the kind of booms and bust cycles within domestic markets. And so the role of monetary policy and the fighting inflation are sort of, I believe, linked to this long-term secular decline in the global economy and having more steer. But there was also a shift towards a monetary dominance away from fiscal policy being directed and monetary policy accommodating that. So overall, austerity-minded fiscal and contractionary monetary policies in most countries have been in response to changes in global financial flows and associated with poor economic performance. The trend in global economic growth has declined over the last 6 decades. And what we see, the outcome of this shift, as countries have and regions particularly have adapted to these changes and responded to the neoliberal ideological changes in different ways, is that we see that Asia, particularly China and India, have contributed much to global growth since the 1980s. We're seeing India's contribution. Hello?
No,
Chairperson?
Yes.
Just on a point of order, I think it's highly inappropriate that we're getting a ideological economics lecture from the Parliamentary Budget Office.
Honorable Berg, I'm not certain that I agree with you on this particular point, because when you look at global trends and how they impact on the status of South Africa, I'm not certain that this is a discussion really that simply says that this is where South Africa's ideological position is. I think from where I sit and having looked at it and going on to what happens next in the presentation, the interrelatedness of global outlooks relative to what happens domestically cannot be disassociated given the budget going next week. That's my reading of the matter.
I take your point, Chair. I take your point, Chair. The challenge here is I'm very happy to be briefed on global geopolitical and otherwise developments, but the classification of anything as neoliberal is an ideological statement. That's not a statement of fact. And we are then being briefed on ideology and not on fact.
I'm afraid I disagree with you, Honorable Member, but Honorable Talega Mazbu.
No, Chair, thank you very much. I agree with you, Chair. I disagree with the Honorable Member. the economic environment in South Africa does not live in isolation from the global economic environment. So I think this slide is proper, and this information is proper for us, Chair, to link our situation domestically with the international activities and the international other things that are impacting our economic policy. So I think it is proper, Chair. I agree with you. The presenter can continue with the presentation. We are really well informed in this case.
I would equally so argue the fact that looking at the statements in the slide that is before us, the same, I would argue Time magazine would make exactly the same point. So I'm not sure that they are inferring in any other way. Let me take one or two inputs. I'd like to move on, honorable members, if it's okay with you. Honorable Douglas and then Honorable Wakelin.
Hi, good day, Mr. Chair. I think from my side, the main thing is just that we need to continue, because this is an ideological debate, but there's no ideology. This is very easy to find information online. There's nothing wrong with these classifications, and it's necessary for us to have a global perspective to the Appropriations Committee, and we need to have an understanding of how things were in the past, present, and how it impacts us in the future. So I think let's just go ahead as is.
Honorable Wakelin.
Chair, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies, my signal is not so great. Chair, I would like to ask that we continue with the presentation, but please allow us to have a set of criticism when we do not agree. I get a sense that sometimes we are not allowed to speak freely on this matter. So let us be clear, Chair, we will raise the points that we are not happy with, and we will allow the speaker to continue. But Chair, let us be clear. We cannot allow ideological submissions done on a budget that has a direct impact currently on everybody that's locally. So we got a problem at the moment that we look at the global outlook, and it doesn't really assist us right now to look at this. We need to look at the current plans that are submitted that will come to us. So Chair, I request that we continue, but however, please be aware and please allow us to present the matters as we see them as well. Thank you, Chair.
No, certainly. And I certainly have allowed Honorable Berg to make the submission. It doesn't necessarily mean that we all agree. And that's why it's important that in this discussion, we also be able to say, where do we sit, where we agree and where we disagree. I think we must proceed with the presentation. And if there are ideological points members want to make, certainly in a political climate, in the deliberations, members can be able to do so. So if I can allow the presenter to continue, we can go from there. But I appreciate what you're saying, Honorable Wakelin.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I just want to say, and I can discuss this more during the question and answer session, but the terminology and my approach in this presentation is not ideological. I'm referring to ideological shifts that are well documented within the literature, both mainstream and non-mainstream economics literature, but as you said, international political economy within the popular media, things like Time magazine. And I mean, the period up to the Great Depression is often within the developed countries described as where liberalism was the major ideology and shaped economic and other policies. Post the Great Depression, and particularly coming out of the Second World War, there was what was often referred to as embedded liberalism, basically developed countries having a capitalist system, but a recognition that in order to manage the financial markets, which had gone crazy before the Great Depression, and to maintain the stability and to maintain rebuild the international trading system, and to rebuild countries after the Second World War, there was a real need for the state to be embedded with the markets and so the term embedded liberalism was used, and then
Siraj, let's move to the next. Let's continue. Thanks.
Called neoliberalism. And so I'm not using this as in a pejorative sense or saying that, this is not a good thing. I'm just saying what happened within the global economy. So just to get back to where I was, so we see China and India contributing much since the 80s. India's contribution and expected contribution in the next few years is still seem to be quite high to global GDP. China is a bit lower, but both China and India are affected by demand in other parts of the world, particularly the developed countries, where, as we saw, low growth. The contributions by developed countries have declined, and we're seeing that the performance from Africa and Latin America has been disappointing. Next slide, please. So to go on to talk about the South African economic policy. Next slide, please. So just to say that the medium-term budget presents the fiscal policy framework that will inform the size of the budget and the amount of money available for the division of resources across spheres of government, across government departments, entities, and other areas. So the amount of resources available for achieving, for instance, the NDP targets and other goals of government are set within that fiscal policy framework. There is room for improvement within government, but ultimately, I think the fiscal policy framework is important for that reason, and I think therefore it's also relevant to the Appropriations Committee, not just the Finance Committee. Fiscal policy is an important tool that the government can use to reduce poverty and inequality, provide basic services, support the development of well-being and capabilities, build productivity in the productive sectors of the economy, build and maintain social and economic infrastructure, and provide stability through counter-cyclical spending to stimulate or moderate economic activity depending on the conditions in the economy. So the aim of this section is to examine the approach of the government economic policy, particularly fiscal policy, and to propose an alternative approach that we think are more suited to the growth and development of the country. Sustainable, inclusive economic growth is the outcome of development actions over time to enhance the capabilities, productivity, and value-adding outputs of the economy while improving the quality of life of all the people, particularly the poorest in society. I think we've made the point before that economies are part dependent. And so what's happened in the past and what we do today affects the shape and the outcomes in the future. The government's current approach is to focus on the short term and views economic growth narrowly as a result of the growth of outputs and perceived business sentiment. Next slide, please. So with regard to actually, let me start and explain. So the National Treasury brought out a macroeconomic review in 2024, and we thought it'd be worth commenting on that because I think that would have a large impact on the medium-term budget policy statement, but also the coming budget in 2025. So our concerns are that we often see what we think the National Treasury mixing up the goals of macroeconomic policy, including fiscal policy, where the ultimate goal should be, as stated in the NDP and accepted, I think, by previous parliaments and government, is to reduce unemployment, poverty, and inequality. But the focus and the fixation of the National Treasury has become the variables of that are ratios of the government's deficit to GDP and debt to GDP, and so we're concerned that ultimately we need to look at the overall picture and how these instruments allow us to achieve our goals. We worried that the review betrays an inadequate understanding of the supply side structural challenge of the economy, which I'll get to in a minute, the role of the demand side of the economy, including investment, employment, and innovation sectors and households in the long run, sustainability and growth of the economy. Sorry, I just saw a message. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I just a message popped up and I thought that I wasn't audible. Thank you. The role. So we're also concerned that the interaction of the supply and demand side of the economy in shaping economic outcomes is not adequately considered or possibly misunderstood. The serious obstacles that South Africa's obscene level of inequality plays in increasing instability and limiting growth. And we argue that an alternative human rights-based approach to public finances, as set out by the UN and other major global organizations, and budgeting would empower the entire population, increase the productivity of the entire workforce, and develop an inclusive, sustainable, and growing economy. Next slide, please. So we concern that the austerity-mindedness of the National Treasury approach will not allow the size of the economic pie to grow, but will cause increased tension and social conflict over the division of a stagnating economy while the population grows. And I think this is really important because also the way in which stability is envisioned within that document by the Treasury is where it doesn't take into account the overall levels of political and economic stability within the country. So we feel that there's a poor understanding and little to offer for how the South African economy can grow in a sustainable, inclusive way while reducing unemployment, poverty, and inequality. In fact, the structural reforms proposed by the National Treasury, while they would be important if part of a proper economic package aimed at long-run reduction in unemployment, poverty, and inequality, development and growth, will very likely entrench the power of the vested interests and power of large corporations that dominate all markets of the economy and extract rents without adequately reinvesting to build the productive sectors and create employment. And I'll show slides that support that view. Weaken the opportunity for small and medium businesses and new entrants to thrive and grow dynamic, innovative, value-adding, employment-creating, productive sectors of the economy, and cause the unemployment rate to increase and entrench inequality. Next slide, please. So just to come to sort of the issues of structure of the economy. So we feel that we need to take into account what the economy is capable of doing and the contributions of different sectors to when we think about the structure of the economy, not just the approach taken in structural reforms where problems with electricity or freight and other network industries, and those things are seen as causing structural problems to the economy. We believe that the structural problems are more long-standing and deeper within the economy. The capital stock of the country provides a sense of how the structure of the economy has evolved over time and what it can produce and where it can create employment and growth in the future. We see that South African dominant corporations have not used their profits and rents for productive investment. In fact, if we look at manufacturing and the industrial sector as an engine of growth, which is accepted in the development economics literature, we see that the capital stock of manufacturing construction, for instance, as a percentage of total capital stock has declined by 2.6% since 1993. If we look at the area where we've had the larger investment and capital stock growth, but also contribution to value added in the economy, we see it's finance, intermediation, insurance, real estate, and business services, what I have as FIIREBS on the legend. We see that real estate activities have made up 74% of the capital stock of this sector. And so while the finance, the contribution of financial sector has grown, what we're seeing is that increased investment in commercial and real estate property prices, increased speculation, particularly in the period running up to the global financial crisis. Within that increased financial speculation, but also people investing in properties and to maintain and to upgrade their properties rather than, and that money being allocated not to the productive sectors of the economy. Next slide, please. So the top graph looks again at comparing capital stock in 1993 and 2023. And the simple point I wanted to make here is that if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, where we have the productive sectors of the economy, we see very little growth in capital stock. And I think it's really important to point out that when you have a weak productive sector in your economy, the kind of services provided in the economy are very different to the kinds of services provided in an economy where you don't really have the productive sector. We have productive services supporting the growth and expansion and the innovation and dynamism of the industrial sector. and in South Africa, because our services sector is different to what you may find in countries where they've had more industrialization. We've actually had deindustrialization, and coming to employment, we've actually talking about the industrialization. We've had less employment over the period 93 to 2023 in manufacturing, in agriculture, in mining and quarrying. And the kind of jobs in the tertiary sector that have actually absorbed most of the employment that we see growth there has been linked to growth in the private security services. as I think inequality has grown and as poverty has increased and fear has increased amongst people with who are more affluent, but also within the business and retail sectors. We've seen increased labor broking, cleaning, outsourcing of cleaning services and those kind of things, where people have been moved, were classified as manufacturing workers and mining workers and workers in other sectors who are now in less stable jobs, I think, in the tertiary sector. Next slide, please. So we spoke earlier about moving towards a kind of human rights approach to fiscal, economic and fiscal policy. And I just thought I'd include quotes here to point out the needs for this. First, to say that the Constitution guarantees the right to adequate housing, healthcare services, sufficient food and water, social assistance, and the right to education. South Africa signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1994, but this was only ratified in 2015. And we see that the Committee on this Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 2018 in the report on South Africa says that the committee reminds the state party that where austerity measures are unavoidable, they should be temporary, covering only the period of the crisis, necessary and proportionate, not result in discrimination and increased inequalities, and ensure that the rights of disadvantaged and marginalized individuals and groups are not disproportionately affected. The other point that we want to make is that the social and economic costs of an approach to public finance that is not adequately guided by human rights-based approach are extremely high. The Human Rights Commission on the National Investigation veering into report into the July 2021 unrest in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal says the government and the private sector have an urgent responsibility to address the socio-economic inequalities and the inequalities of access to the economy, which are differentiated along racial lines in patterns that are reflective of a racialized economy. The state must take steps to ensure socio-economic transformation of the racial dynamic of the economy. So I'm going to end there with those quotes. So thank you very much. And I'm very happy to come back to many of these issues in the question discussion time. Thank you, Chair. Next presenter, please.
Thank you very much, Suraj, Chairperson, honorable members. I'll be taking you through the slides focusing on the fiscal framework and essentially trying to offer a critical account of how National Treasury has approached fiscal and debt sustainability. In the second part of my presentation, I'll also propose alternative strategies that government could consider in order to achieve debt sustainability and inclusive growth. So on this slide, we want to make 3 key points on the credibility of the fiscal framework. The first being that despite the introduction of fiscal consolidation since 2012, both the budget deficit and the debt to GDP level have increased, as seen on the graph on your right. The second point that we want to make is that fiscal consolidation, and I think Suraj also alluded to this point earlier on, is that fiscal consolidation forces government into short-term thinking. The third point is that, as shown in the literature and as well as in international evidence, fiscal consolidation has not delivered on its promises of higher economic growth and low debt levels. In fact, what we have seen is a further deterioration of key developmental outcomes, including unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Next slide, please. Chairperson, the point we're trying to make on this slide is that the fiscal framework is not merely a technical exercise of simply balancing revenue and expenditure. I think it's more than that. It is a strategic tool that can help government progressively achieve socio-economic rights on behalf of its people, and therefore it carries significant socio-economic and political economy implications. And as such, we argue that fiscal targets should not take precedence over social well-being. The fiscal framework has to focus on elevating the suffering of millions of households and also help them to build resilience to risks. It must promote social stability, but also foster economic development. I think one of the concerns that we had raised during the February budget in relation to the fiscal framework was that we're worried that it overlooks critical risks. And Suraj had touched on some of these risks during the Global Outlook discussions around geopolitical conflicts, domestic protests, climate change, etc. Next slide, please. So in the next two slides, we present an alternative approach to debt sustainability that moves beyond this narrow focus on high debt levels and rising debt service costs. Chairperson, I think indeed, while debt is conventionally viewed as a liability, international examples from countries like Brazil, China, South Korea, Ethiopia, and the likes, which are all developmental states, show that when debt is used correctly, it can be leveraged as a strategic asset for financing of investment in things such as infrastructure, education, healthcare, and social programs, which are all aimed at eradicating poverty and inequality. So in terms of approach, we propose that debt sustainability should be viewed within the context of economic growth and development, especially since debt is often expressed as a percentage of GDP. So by prioritizing growth, that naturally reduces your debt burden. We've also made the point on several occasions that government can indeed positively impact economic growth, and especially in this environment, by directing resources towards poor households, towards the provision of public services, towards infrastructure investment, and all of this in pursuit of a demand-led growth trajectory. Moreover, we've also seen during the February budget with the deployment of GFRECA that government can leverage its full public sector balance sheet to fund a targeted fiscal stimulus for the economy. Likewise, debt sustainability also requires increased revenue, which can be achieved in two ways. One, you could either expand the tax base through progressive tax reforms that are targeted at high-income earners, multinational corporations, and world taxes without necessarily burdening the poor. The second way could be through combating illicit financial flows by addressing tax evasion and capital flight in order to secure more resources for public investment. Next slide, please. Honorable members, debt service cost, as you all know, is the fastest growing expenditure item on the budget, and thus makes it essential that any meaningful debt reduction strategy has to manage and reduce these interest payments. However, addressing this challenge requires more than just cutting expenditure. It demands a more nuanced understanding of how both fiscal and monetary policy, through the repo rate, inflation, and exchange rate, shapes the interest on government bonds. And therefore, I re-emphasize that excessive spending cuts alone are not a sustainable solution. Rather, a more strategic approach is required from the National Treasury. Its role must extend beyond merely just issuing government bonds at market-determined rates. It must recognize that debt service costs can be reduced through a number of targeted interventions. And these include, for instance, short-term borrowing in the current environment, because what we've seen is that interest rates on the lower end of the yield curve have reduced. There's interventions such as targeted negotiation, prescribed lending, and also securing credit or capital on more favorable terms, including from development financial institutions and the South African Reserve Bank. Now, regarding the Reserve Bank, Chairperson, I think it's evident that South Africa needs a more proactive and developmental central bank that supports the country's efforts to address unemployment and to stimulate economic growth. In this specific context of debt sustainability, I think the SAP can simply play an important role, that is, by purchasing government bonds during periods of economic distress in order to stabilize bond markets and reduce borrowing costs. And Chairperson, contrary to popular belief, this is not necessarily a radical proposal. It's well within the legal framework. The SAPS Act of 1989, Act 90, does permit the SAP to purchase government bonds within legislated limits. In fact, we have even seen this in practice during the COVID-19 pandemic. The SAP bought government bonds to the tune of approximately 82 billion worth of government bonds in the secondary market in order to maintain market stability. Chairperson, I'll conclude by saying that a more balanced and proactive approach is needed to achieve sustainable debt management and to ensure that inclusive growth takes place. I'll hand over to my next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Chepo. Next slide, please. So members, the next few slides are just included to show you where we are at the moment, or where we were at the end of August in terms of the implementation of the current budget. So the departments that spend more than 50% and less than 30% of their total budget is shown in the table, and you will see that military veterans shows slow spending at this stage, and it also correlates with the same period in last year's over the last financial year. So that is actually a continuous trend in terms of military veterans. The higher than the national benchmark of 42% in the spending trend in higher education and training is in line with the previous trends and the operations of the department. Next slide. Departments that transfer more than 50% of their budget to other institutions, you will see most of the departments has transferred their transfer budgets. Again, higher education and training is already at 70%, but it's also in line with previous and also in terms of the operations. Small business has also transferred 60% of their transfer budget, and tourism is currently on 64.5%. Next slide. The first table shows the spending trend of departments that allocated more than 10% of their total budget on capital assets, and two others that overspend on capital assets. You will see the presidency has overspent. So what that means is that they've spent more on capital than that, and in terms of their budget. Parliament, which has a budget of 18.4% of their total budget for capital, is on 49%. Home Affairs is the other one that did not have actually a budget for capital, but they've spent. And then Stats SA has got a budget of 12.3% of their total budget for capital. They're on 42.6%, and Water and Sanitation has got a budget 18% of their total budget on capital, and they're on 44%. The reason why we included the presidency and Home Affairs is just to indicate that we will have to check now in the adjustments budget that because those budgets will have to be corrected in terms of in the adjustments budget. So they will do virements, so the underspending in other items will have to cover the overspending in terms of capital expenditure. The second table shows overspending on transfers and subsidies. Those departments were the Presidency, Planning, Monitoring, Public Service Commission, Stats SA, Civilian Secretariat, and the Office of the Chief Justice. These overspendings will also be adjusted in the adjusted budget that will be tabled with the MTBPS. Next slide. Members, you had a special request to the PBO to look at the indirect conditional grants. So this diagram is showing the expenditure of the indirect conditional grants over the last 5 years between 2018 and 2022. We ended up in 2022 because we've only got the performance information until 2022-23 on these conditional grants. In terms of the school infrastructure grant, you can see the trend. It went down in 2020, but we actually moving up. At the moment we are spending 92% of that grant, but the ones that we actually should look at are the ones, the in-kind grants to local governments. The poorest performing one is the Municipal Systems Improvement Grant, which in 2022 they've only spent 45%. So members, this is just to show the trend of the last 5 years of the spending in these grants. The next 3 slides, members, I've also included the performance information. We don't have to go through them because it's really a long list in terms of the performance, but what we will see, Mapule can show the next slide. What you will actually see is that the performance is actually directly linked to the expenditure trends as well. So you can go through these. These are all the indicators that they've listed in the schedules to the Division of Revenue Act in terms of the indirect conditional grants. You can go to the last slide, Mapula, of this 3. Next. These are all the health indicators. Next. I just want to show you the last slide. Next. The last slide on the mineral on corporate governance. I actually want to show the corporate governance. You can see the performance that the trend that we've seen in the expenditure is definitely reflected in the performance as well. That grant is supposed to address municipal staff matters, and you will see in 2018 the performance was 0, 2019 0, 2020 0. 21 0, and 2022 it just indicated in the schedule the actual output was addressed. So what that means, we don't know what they've actually spent in terms of addressing the staff matters. Next. So I'll just hand over to Busi that will go through the revenue trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelia. I'm going to take the committee through the revenue trends. Good morning once again. We see that over the past 5 years, there have been changes in tax revenue and policy. We saw that nominal gross tax revenue increased from about 1.3 trillion to about 1.7 trillion in 2023-2024. In 2022-2023. So, but personal income tax has been adjusted above inflation in 2020 and 2021. And it was in line with inflation in 2022 and 2023. Personal income tax, it remains the largest contributor to tax revenue post the pandemic. We saw as well that value-added tax has remained the second largest contributor to tax revenue. It has recovered since the pandemic. However, with corporate income tax, it's been inconsistent. You will recall that in April 2022, corporate income tax was reduced from 28% to 27%. So that's also the cause of the decline in collections thus far. In 2024, in the budget itself, the nominal gross tax revenue was projected to increase to about 2.13 trillion in 2016-2017. However, we do expect that with the impact of the withdrawal from the two-pot system, the MTB nominal tax revenue might be adjusted upwards. Next slide, please. Well, it is quite important so that obviously more revenue that is collected, it means that there's more in the cake to be able to fund government priorities. This slide just provides tax revenue collection to date. SARS collected about 28.5 billion more in revenue between April 2024 and August 2024, which is a 4.3% year-on-year increase. However, we do see that 2 of the major 3 tax revenue sources underperformed. Like we indicated in the previous slide, personal income tax collection have increased by about 29.1 billion, which is 11.7% year-on-year increase. This increase is due to increased employment in the sector, as well as average wage settlement that came around 6.3% in 2023. We do see that corporate income tax continues to fall. Current collection is down by 2.7 billion or 2.2% year-on-year. This can largely be attributed to the contraction in the contribution of the mining sector following the collapse of the commodity boom. VAT collections, on the other hand, decreased slightly by 1.2 billion or negative 0.7%. This is linked to higher tax refunds. Fuel levy collections declined by R1 billion or 2.7% year on year. This can be attributed to the government relief that was offered since there was no increase in the full levy collections. Other tax revenues showed mixed results. Dividend tax grew by 2.9%, while custom duties fell by 18.3%. We saw that the specific excise duty also declined by 3% to 53.5 billion. The skills development levy, which is linked to employment because employers then have to pay a certain amount towards this levy, it rose by 8.2% to 22.6 billion at the end of August. Ad valorem taxes increased by 33% to 7.3 billion, indicating there's some very good consumption growth. Thank you.
Honourable members, I'll be taking you through social grants. In particular, we'll be looking at the trends of beneficiaries. Can I please, yeah, okay, that's fine. As members know, in South Africa, we do have a triple challenge of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. This is widely known. And as a result, it means that there are many people who need the grant to diversify their incomes in their households to be able to sustain themselves. Because of the structure of the economy, we have long-term cumulative negative impacts on households and communities and society broadly. And as already stated, grants are a lifeline for many households. More than 27 million beneficiaries received the social grants. On the table on the right, we show you the levels of the grants. And as members may know, grant in aid and the child support grant are the lowest grants. And in fact, those two grants fall below the food poverty line of 796 Rand a month. So what this means is that the grants remain too small to protect the poorest children from hunger, malnutrition, and stunting. And as we know in South Africa, we've got high levels of hunger, malnutrition, and stunting, particularly for children. The numbers of people receiving the child grant are increasing, which will go next slide, please, which shows the need for the child grant and its necessity in many households. On this slide, we're showing you the trends in the numbers of beneficiaries. I think just to highlight for members to see there that the old age grant is increasing over the medium term, or is expected to increase, which basically shows the aging population. So the aging population is something we're going to have to think about and consider deeply, particularly how those people are cared for, how they sustain themselves and so forth. But grants again remain necessary for these people to be able to sustain themselves. The war veterans grants decline, which is also expected in terms of that demographic group is changing. Disability grants remain about stable, 1 million beneficiaries, and slightly increased to 1.1 million people in the medium term. However, as we know with disability grants, they are hard to access, and we're probably underestimating the number of people who actually live with disabilities, and also because it's very difficult for people to be able to access this grant because of the amount of evidence that needs to be provided to show that one has a disability. As already stated, the child support grants beneficiary numbers are expected to grow from 13 million to 13.8 million. Just to note for members that the foster care grants are declining, and as the PBO we previously highlighted that the foster care grants continue to decline. And this raises questions about whether there are less children being foster cared for, or whether less people are accessing this grant for other reasons. So this is a question really for us as well to understand why foster care grants declining over time. The care dependency grants are also growing, and the grant in aid also increases in the medium term. So generally, the trend is that the number of beneficiaries are generally increasing on a total front. And again, this is basically because of the vulnerabilities that households are facing, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and because of what has happened in terms of the economic trajectory, which has already been covered since then. The next slide, please. In terms of the SRD grant, as members know, the SRD grant has been extended to March 2025. And obviously has been continuously extended. As we've already noted previously as the PBO, is that the way that the grant was structured, which is that the amount was allocated, which then determined the number of beneficiaries, as opposed to the beneficiaries driving the budget allocation itself, has meant that many people have been excluded from this grant. And as we know that unemployment remains high in South Africa, 8.4 million people unemployed, 3.4 million discouraged job seekers. and 13.1 million not economically active people. But at the same time, as much as people aren't necessarily getting the grant and are being excluded, SASSA is underspending, which raises concern about, we should be spending this money on those people. There should be no reason for underspend, given the level of vulnerability that households are facing, particularly after the pandemic. So what we really want to raise here for members is that, the discussion on social security has to continue. And the main question being what happens after March 2025. And here we raise some questions that members should be considering, which is what will happen to the millions who remain vulnerable to poverty and hunger after 2025? What will happen to those who are being excluded from the current grant? Have the socioeconomic risks being adequately considered and addressed? What measures need to be in place to progressively realize the constitutional obligations of the state to provide social security for all? And just to highlight for members that, the section 27 of our constitution is very clear that everyone, and it says everyone specifically, and our constitution is clear when it says everyone versus citizens versus so forth, but says everyone has the rights to social security. And so one of the budget considerations should always be about how we progressively realizing the rights to social assistance in South Africa. And of course, the SRD creates a room for us to consider the 18 to 59 group that has previously been excluded, except for those obviously with disabilities and who access the grants differently. But to basically say that this has to be an ongoing conversation about how do you progressively realize the right to social assistance for all, for everyone, as the Constitution states in South Africa. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Buzi. Next slide. Members, we thought it will be useful to include a few slides on the recommendations, what has been made previously, and also during the planning sessions, in each planning sessions, members actually indicated that they want to amend the budget. And also in your one of your recommendations in your appropriations report, you actually said that all parliamentary committees of parliament exercise their legal rights as provided for in the Money Bills Act and recommend the amendment of the budget to the appropriations committees of parliament, where they hold a view of a misalignment between the budget and government policy, which is a very good recommendation. And we thought we'll try and assist and see where the problems are, why we don't amend. So members, in retrospect, we looked at all the recommendations made by committees in 2023 to get an idea whether the recommendations had influence on budget allocations. So in 2023, we saw that 14 portfolio committees recommended additional budget allocations, to which the Minister of Finance responded in the following manner. So he said, due to the constrained fiscal position, departments, public entities and other institutions are required to reprioritize existing funds for emerging priorities. Should committees then lobby for more funds or rather focus on efficiency gains within the budget? That's just a question we can ask ourselves. All accounting officers must implement measures to minimize inefficiency and ways to improve value for money. Rollover requests do not qualify or were approved in the 2023 adjustments appropriations. What this means is that the review process did not consider the adjusted appropriations. So we realized that the budget review process is only finalized after the approval of the appropriations bill, but before the tabling of the MTBPS and the adjustments budget. So committees recommended that the rollovers must be that department's request must be approved, but it has already been approved, and then it will be tabled in the adjustments budget. So there's a timing issue with the BRR process. And also one of the other answers from the minister was that some of these changes has been included in the 2024 MTEF, which means that the 2024 MTEF was also not considered when the recommendations were made. Also, in the beginning of this year, with the tabling of the budget, a second adjustments appropriations bill for 2023 was tabled in January, of which adjustments were made to 3 of the 14 departments that I just mentioned above. None of the adjustments correlate with funding requests from the committees. So there was a total disjuncture between with the second adjustments bill and what the committees actually recommended. Funds were moved from the EPWP and CWP programs for other purposes. The perception is that this must have been due to the review of the set public employment programs, of which Parliament was not even aware of. Next slide. Committee reports submitted by finance committees mainly make recommendations to address the macroeconomic situation in the country that could be addressed by fiscal and monetary policy decisions, as well as the inefficiency and governance matters within departments and public entities. Some of these policy matters should in fact be taken up with the presidency, not really with the Minister of Finance. One specific recommendation was a request for the Treasury to provide detailed plans on the coordination of public employment programs. That was a very important recommendation, but Parliament did not receive the detailed plans for all employment programs, or in fact, we haven't seen those detailed plans. Funding also continues, even though the Minister acknowledges that most of the programs focus on skills to make the youth employable, and those programs do not really create jobs. Most of the recommendations that concern monetary policy were acknowledged by the Minister of Finance and referred members to Chapter 3 of the budget review, which discussed the drivers of growth, and he also referred members to Chapter 3 and 5 that sets out details of expenditure on government programs supporting the poor and provide employment opportunities. The Treasury, the Minister actually said there was one of the questions, the response to one of the questions was that the Treasury monitors expenditure through the in-year monitoring system, and they produce reviews to determine the efficiency and effectiveness of programs, of which the evaluation of public employment programs to address fragmentation and funding is included. It would be useful actually to see those reviews, and the Treasury actually present those reviews to this committee. To be able to these reviews, one needs, yes, what I want to say is that for the Treasury to do these reviews, they need to assess performance on the outputs of these programs. It is also expected that these reviews influence the amendments to budget allocations and should be presented as motivation for specific amendments, especially this time of the year. One would see the evidence that actually informs the changes to the budget. Next slide. Committee reports by appropriations committees mainly recommended the approval of adjustments that were already approved by the Treasury. One would expect recommendations on the adjustments to conditional grants, for example, which can only be approved by Parliament. And there's actually no process in place for Parliament to approve these adjustments before the tabling of the adjusted appropriations bill. Members, in practice, some of the adjustments can be approved by accounting officers. Some of the adjustments for the adjustments budget needs to go through the Treasury for approval, but there's a specific process described by the PFMA to do that process. But that process does not exist in Parliament. So when this committee received the adjusted appropriations, those changes has already been included in the adjustments appropriations bill. So it will be useful if we could establish a process where, especially for the conditional grants, that the departments that want to make changes to conditional grants, because it's specifically and exclusively appropriated in the appropriations bill, for this committee to approve before they actually include those adjustments in the adjustments appropriations bill. One specific recommendation is the finalization of the review process of the social grant system. The answer to this question was that this review was concluded, but the Department of Social Development and the National Treasury have not yet reached agreement on the way forward. So how does this actually affect the budget? Another very specific recommendation that required a 60-day feedback period is a plan for the review and reconfiguration of the executive function of the state to address the duplication and inefficiency. This was noted by the Treasury, but requires further engagement with the presidency. Two recommendations that were welcomed by the Treasury are the regulation of municipal surcharges and the alignment of conditional grant conditions to promote efficiency, specifically in water management. This needs to be demonstrated. The answer from Treasury was that this needs to be demonstrated in the conditional grant schedules. And this is actually a Treasury responsibility, but that was the answer. I also checked that specific grant, and in that specific grants, several outputs, 6, are actually listed in the schedules. But unfortunately, the actual service delivery reports only include reports on 2 of the 6 outputs for regional bulk infrastructure, for the grant infrastructure grant. So members, who is actually responsible to monitor the implementation of those grants? Is it the Treasury or is it the DPME? Yes, but we actually also really need to look at the schedules and how departments report in terms of the outputs required for specific grants. Next slide. So a few possible recommendations to improve the budget process in Parliament. So by comparing the processes to amend money bills established in the executive with the processes to approve, amend or reject money bills in Parliament, the following challenges need urgent intervention. Timing and the number of PRR should be addressed. We recommend that the first PRR should include an analysis of the annual performance plan, the budget and the first quarter results, while a second, which we don't have currently, while a second PRR should address the performance of the first 6 months and the analysis of the annual reports and adjusted budgets. Timing and process followed by the mini plenaries. This process should start immediately after the tabling of the budget, and discussions must be based on the first PRR. The process should be concluded in time to make recommendations for the adjustments budget process. The mini plenary should focus on strategic and budget discussions and compliance matters to also prevent AG findings, and it should be informed by the PRRs. Responses by the Executive and Minister of Finance should not be restricted to the budget review. Recommendations from the PRRs should be included in the MTBPS as well. Specifically, members, you actually made very good recommendations in your appropriations report, but the minister will only respond, or the relevant ministers will only respond in the BRR. So if you could have had these recommendations now, you could actually also, your next recommendations could be more relevant and realistic for the 2025 budget. A process for Parliament to approve adjustments to specifically and exclusively appropriated funds before the compilation of the adjustments budget process should be implemented. I'm also certain that our experienced researchers could add to these possible solutions. Next slide. I'll hand over to Busi.
Members, some of you might be familiar with the Gender Responsive Planning, Budgeting, Monitoring, Evaluation and Auditing Framework, which was adopted by Cabinet in March 2019. Gender Responsive Budgeting began in the 1980s when there was a recognition that macroeconomic policies are not neutral and that different people experience budgets differently. And as some of you may be aware, South Africa was one of the few countries to implement gender responsive budgeting in the 90s. And we actually had 2 successful gender responsive budgeting projects. This project emerged in 2019 when the president acknowledged that, we still had deep gender inequality in our society, and that budget is a way of resolving some of these inequalities or trying to make the country more gender equitable. In the 2022 budget, the National Treasury announced that they'd be implementing gender responsive budgeting into the 2023-24 medium-term budget policy statement. However, this did not take place and has been extended out. And in the 2024 budget earlier this year, the budget did not really reference gender responsive budgeting except in the appendix. And so the National Treasury is committed to providing progress on gender responsive budgeting in this upcoming MTBPS. So this is really to flag to members that this is something members should be looking out for to see whether National Treasury will in fact provide the progress on the gender responsive budgeting. And so in the previous budgets, what the National Treasury has noted is that some departments have been selected to participate in the pilot program. However, we still do not have information on which departments and what their progress is. And so this is a question that members should be asking about which departments have been selected, what is the progress report so far. But the Department of Women and Youth and People with Disabilities has continued to hold workshops with government officials, civil society and academia on this framework. And so we're hoping to see some developments on that front. So this is just really to flag to members that this is a critical issue to look at, and to also note that the Department of Women did acknowledge that there's been regression in gender responsive budgeting in South Africa since the 1990s, and primarily because there hasn't been directive from the Department of Finance, or the Finance Ministry is how they frame it. And so to understand that for a successful gender responsive budgeting initiative is that you do need National Treasury to be a leading participant in it, but also for members to appreciate that in the early on gender responsive budgeting initiatives were actually primarily in Parliament with the Finance and Appropriations committees, which is also what made them successful, with National Treasury also being involved in these initiatives. We will be publishing a paper on gender responsive budgeting, which members will circulate with members to read more about gender responsive budgeting and some of our concerns about the current approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Chair, members, in conclusion, in summary, we do emphasize the importance of the committee and Parliament recognizing this powerful tool it has in recommending in terms of how budget has to be allocated. And we really emphasize the importance of following through on those recommendations and ensuring that there's proper response by government. In particular, the concerns about delay in implementing, as Busa was saying, the gender responsive approach, the gender responsive budgeting approach, but also, one of the broader message you're bringing in this presentation also relates to how much we have seen very slow progress in improvement of many of the developmental indicators over the years, particularly since the implementation of the fiscal consolidation strategy, which at the United Nations there also been questions. I know a recent statement by the Secretary General raising concerns around particular developing countries, requesting them to be bold and ensuring that there's more expansive fiscal policy to try and improve socioeconomic issues. And we are very concerned that any further implementation of a strategy, it has to be backed with proper evidence that it will not lead to similar outcome that we've seen over the past 15 years. We also emphasize the importance of recognizing the importance of government policies around basic services, social grants. In our view, it's important that these services are protected over time on the budget, particularly looking at how we are, with structural issues we have around unemployment and poverty inequality. So it's very important that whatever happens, some of these important policy provisions are protected in the budget. Next slide. Also the debate at the United Nations has been the reconciliation of human rights-based economic approach, in particular just try to deal with some of the socioeconomic issues, and in the long term, showing the evidence it deals with public finance issues over time as well. Again, just to reiterate the points around the use of the committee's recommendations in driving or directing the budget allocations over these key development areas, the importance of ensuring the monitoring evaluation department and other similar entities are providing more useful information in measuring the progress in this regard. It's very important. We emphasize the importance of increased public investment and its crucial importance in ensuring productivity and strengthening economic resilience, particularly when focusing on productive sectors of the economy. We also raise concerns around ensuring that social grants is really been given, the coverage is wide enough to ensure that we support poor households in particular and deal with the blockages of ensuring this policy is equitably or is efficiently implemented. We're concerned around that. The need for tax reforms, ensuring that we can still raise more revenue without really impacting on the low-income households in particular. We've raised a provocative question, which I want to also remind members around, the questions, what is this midterm budget based on? If we don't have a midterm budget, midterm development strategy in place, particularly that we expect that strategy to have a long-term strategic view and this budget to fit into it. We're concerned that it's not in place, and it's a question that has to be raised quite sharply in our discussion, in the Parliament and committee's discussion in this regard. Also, importance of ensuring that the structural reforms, oversight over these, they don't deepen democratic considerations and lead to inequality, particularly when we realize that they don't necessarily focus on changing the structural economy, but largely focus on supporting the current structure of the economy. Chair, we'll stop here for now and really thank you. It took a long time. Thank you for the opportunity and members, and we will respond to questions now. Thank you so much, Chair and members. Thank you.
Thank you to the team from PBO. I appreciate the broadness of the discussion that we've taken. There are many aspects that we've got to look at here. So with that in mind, I'm going to allow members to make submissions, questions, etc., and then we can go from there. Let me open the floor for questions. If you can indicate by raising your hand in the presentation, that would be super. Honorable Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the... I'm just looking at hands. Honorable Bartlett, any other hands? Kingsley, okay, that covers that. I'm assuming... okay. Let me, and then Honorable...
My hand is up also, Chair.
Okay, and Honorable Kalega Mazibuko. So let's go in that way. Honorable Douglas, you go.
Thank you.
I saw that on
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me take this off. Thank you for the presentation to the PBO team. I think it was very well presented and a lot of very well articulated. I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. But I think it was good to have this presentation to give us a framework looking at how we move forward and how we unpack this in particular. The presentation notes that fiscal consolidation has not effectively reduced deficits and debt over the past decade. Given that South Africa's debt to GDP ratio has risen approximately 52% in 2012 to an estimated 71.4% by 2023, what alternative fiscal policy strategies does the PBO suggest to stabilize debt while still addressing poverty inequality? Because we have to balance the two. Then with the National Treasury projecting gross tax revenue to rise from 1.863 trillion in 2024 and 25 to 2.133 trillion by 2026 and 27. How realistic is this growth, to be honest? What expectation, given South Africans' current economic challenges, including stagnant growth in high employment? It sounds like a very optimistic figures as far as I'm concerned. So it would be good to just glean from the PBO what your opinion is on this growth, and then will government be able to pull this off? And then the unemployment rate remains critically high, with over 8.4 million unemployed people, 3.4 million disguised job seekers, and 13.1 million not economically active. How does the PBO advise Parliament to allocate budget resources effectively to address job creation sustainably? I know these are political kind of questions, but it is raised major concerns if you look at the numbers at the end of the day. And again, things like personal income tax, which is the largest share of tax revenue, comprising about 38% of total revenue. Considering this heavy reliance, what measures can Parliament pursue to ensure that PIT does not disproportionately burden lower income households while maintaining revenue levels? Because
thank you, Honorable Douglas. Honorable Bartlett, you are next.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and forgive me for not switching on my video, if you permit it. Chair, I just have 3 questions. Maybe just clarity on the issue of the school spending grant. I didn't hear that. And then also on the municipal grant, the spending on that. And then on my second point, Chair, about the social grants, I think the one of the school was on slide 34. According to the social grounds, Chair, they mentioned this thing of the foster care grant that is declining. And they couldn't give us an answer why, unless I missed out on that. Chair, what I wanted to mention, because I know how these foster care issues are working. So we just want to know, what are they going to do? Because there's a lot of children without parents or single parents, or most of them are in a line and waiting to be adopted. I know the last time when we checked, the social workers had a lot of workload and there wasn't enough social workers. So they maybe can do on that, because this is very important. Remember, most of our children are school going age, and by the age of 18, in the past, when they reach the age of 18, they could still apply until they are done with their studies after grade 12. But then a few years later, it just ends at when they are 18, and then nobody's providing for them. If they can just give us clarity on that, Chair. And then my last one is on the asylum seekers, Chair. I'm not sure did they mention it. The reason why I'm speaking about the asylum seekers, because it also had an impact on our social grants. The last time, in one of our documents, we read that the asylum seekers are political refugees from their countries. And there's nothing negative that I mean by that. Some of them are struggling to go back, or some of them say their lives are in danger with a lot of issues, Chair. But the reason why I'm mentioning it, because the ones who are not going back, they are also applying for grants in our country. And like I said, I don't mean anything by that. So it also has an impact on our budget on the social grants, Chair. So if they can just check, because asylum seekers who are granted refugee status, they are allowed to work in the country. And nobody can give us credit on that. Like I said, it made a huge impact, especially on our social grants, on our SRDs, and we can't get answers about that. And this is not about xenophobia. This is about clarity that I'm seeking. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Honorable Bartlett. Honorable Waitlin. Honorable Waitlin.
Thank you, Chair. Am I audible? My apologies, my signal is not so great.
Now we can hear you, yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So let me start off by first and foremost say we concede and we agree. There are a lot of poor people in this country. There are a lot of people that are desperate, and we accept that. That's the basis for the argument today is to say to you, it's for that exact reason that we need to grow the economy, because we need to move away from a welfare state to get economic active people. And I think that is where I totally disagree with the submission and the criticism against National Treasury. I think what my concern is with the presentation is that there is the matter of fiscal and financial discipline that I don't hear they talking about. And that's why I've said to you, Chair, that we need not to move along political lines. We need to move along the real economic situation that we are faced with. So first and foremost, this is a very biased presentation as far as particularly the criticism around National Treasury. The rest with it, we can live with, and we can find a solution and find alternative ways of dealing with the economy and the budget appropriation. But my concern is that it is a very biased presentation. It does not talk of a number of issues. Let me raise a few matters, and I'm sure my colleagues will add if they thought so. The first one is the matter of corruption in the last 30 years plus. We have seen the direct impact of corruption, and that is not addressed in the presentation. And why it is not, that concerns me first and foremost, and I would have expected much better from the Budget Office to at least raise those matters. The matter of fiscal and financial discipline and the department's spending the wasteful and irregular expenditure that we have found have not been addressed in this presentation. And I'm very concerned about that and why those things are not highlighted and sensitized as part of the presentation. The matter of taxing to death the current taxpayers, as opposed to grow the current tax base and not coming forward with a proper presentation around that and how we should do that, that concerns me. I am very concerned that the current economic growth rate is not going to be achieved if we are going to keep on taxing the same people to death. I want to ask, Chair, that we reconsider the presentation and the recommendation as they were presented. I don't agree with a number of those as presented. However, I do agree with some of the recommendations as far as the fiscal discipline and how we're going to deal with the departments. Those are the things that we as a committee should keep ourselves busy with, and not with some other presentations around ideology that actually does not interest us at the moment. Chair, I want to be clear on this matter. We don't agree with a number of these issues, and I think I've made it clear, Chair. My last point, and these are just comments, but my question is, and I raised this with my own caucus to say, we are busy with a medium-term development plan. However, if the target dates and target sets are still with the National Development Plan, there is no way that we will achieve a large number of those national development targets. And I would request the Budget Office to please respond to that and say, will we see that the medium-term development plan do some adjustment and make it realistic, as opposed to giving us a national development plan that I think that we will not that we will not achieve, and we are part of this GNU. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Wakeling. Honorable Kaleka Mazibuko.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chairperson, may I request to switch off my video so that at least
Sure,
I'm
sure. We can keep the signal, sure.
You can see, yeah, thank you. Chair, let me echo the sentiments of my colleagues in appreciating the presentation and the information we got from PBS. My first question, Chair, would be, what is it that government can do differently to realize the impact of this budget? Because year in, year out, budget is being approved, which of course has to follow the strategy and the plans. However, the gap in the UPI is increasing. We are having more unemployment. We are having the rate of poverty is not reducing. The rate of inequality, the gap is even widening more. So what is it this time around on this 7th administration that the government can do differently to realize the impact of this budget? And my anxiety, Chair, is about the departments that are not spending. I mean, military veterans is a disgrace, and water and sanitation. And yet we have so much problems with the infrastructure in that department, and the water problems we're having, even the water we're getting from Katsi Dam, the infrastructure there, the infrastructure of the old pipes that needs to be revamped. And but the department is low in spending. So what we need to advocate for, Chair, is that the departments that are not spending must not get budget. You know, well, this is a midterm budget where the budget will be moved around from those who are not spending and that, but in the future, when budget is done next year, those departments really shouldn't get the budget, because it's actually an insult to the citizens of this country. And it's due to poor planning, poor process, which includes poor monitoring and evaluation. Because you can't do M&E at the tail end of the financial year. M&E begins at the planning stage, but it's like how these departments are really planning and even the monitoring and evaluation. So I had a question on the presentation that was where should M&E happen within the department or in the presidency. If we have the department that is charged with that responsibility, then the department must perform. If the department is not performing, it means we have to monitor the performance and make sure that the department is performing. And the issue of the municipal grant, which includes equitable share, my take there, Chair, would be municipal grant equitable share should go where it is going to be utilized. The state of municipalities and the rate the municipalities are utilizing this grant is actually alarming. So as much as we will be doing oversight on the municipalities, but it should be clear that if they don't spend this grant, if they don't spend it appropriately, then the municipalities are not going, because every time the money will go back to treasury, but there are no consequences thereof. You know, there's no consequence management. I think it is time that as this committee of appropriations, we have teeth and we make sure that the citizens of this country are well spent. The issue of the SRD grant, yes, I do agree with the question that after next year, 2025, what then will happen, especially because we have already created dependency in this regard. There are households that are depending on this grant, but the corruption and the defaulting of the system, people who are deceiving the system in this grant is alarming. I've seen a letter that is written by some professionals, including the NGOs and that, to the president in terms of the SRD grant. And it is because I think the systems are not in place to make sure that there is no corruption, there is no defaulting of this, not necessarily defaulting, but there are people who are not supposed to be getting this grant, who are getting the grant. I think my colleague spoke about some foreign nationals who are robbing the system and getting through and getting the grant, and the real people who are supposed and qualified to get the grant are actually not getting the grant. And I think that is the cry of the petition that I saw running around, that people who are supposed to be getting the grant are not getting it. So it means there are no controls in place to make sure that this grant goes to people who really deserve. So I think then it then boils back to issue of monitoring and evaluation that I've alluded to at the beginning. But thank you very much, Chair, for having organized in the team this workshop. It has really empowered us. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Talega Mazibuko. Honorable Neil May and then Honorable Burke.
Good morning, Chair, and apologies for entering at about 9:10. My signal is very bad, so if you don't mind, I am also not going to put my camera on. And good morning to my colleagues. Thank you very much for the presentation. Chair, my question was also about what alternatives do we have in addressing this this budget? We have all these repayments and loans to international, to the different banks that we need to pay back. And if you look at the cumulative fruitful and wasteful expenditure just of our SOEs from 2019 to 2023, you're looking at 2.8 trillion. Now, some of those things have not been addressed in the sense the irregular expenditure for that was 69.3 billion. And then our national departments are 1.48 billion on fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So now the elephant in the room is that we have all the challenges of our departments and SOEs not managing their finances correctly. We have the historical debt. So what is it that we can do differently in managing our budget and taking into account the challenges that we have? The Reserve Bank, how do we address the recommendation that we heard in the beginning to becoming more developmental. You know, how do we go about that with regards to the Reserve Bank? You know, it seems to be that policy in which the Reserve Bank operates needs to be looked at so that it can be developmental. Obviously not to bail out, but maybe to change the way we will be managing our budget nationally. The other thing was the military vets. That was another area that my colleagues mentioned, that with regards that I cannot understand, that underspending. Again, the municipal system improvement, the MIC funding, that is another thing. So when we interrogate the municipalities, one needs to have a look at why are they not spending their money. The Treasury alignment with the NDP, I had a look at that. Chair, I think with this midterm, we need to call those departments, which I agree with my colleagues, to account with regards to their underspending. And at the same time, in dealing with the kind of caliber and skills of those that are supposed to be the accounting officers. The accounting officers at the end of the day are responsible as per the Municipal Finance Act as well as the PFMA. So those are areas that we need to start holding people accountable so that at least we manage to see the light at the end of the tunnel with regards to the budget and our finances in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Nile. Honourable Burke.
Chair, I'm going to quote the second sentence of Wikipedia's definition of neoliberalism to get started. It says the term has multiple competing definitions and is often used pejoratively. In scholarly use, the term is often left undefined or used to describe a multitude of phenomena. I won't engage with a colleague further that gave the presentation that he did on the economic ideology, which is what it was. But I will say to Dr. Jantjies that he's got a problem. If he's bringing folks like this into a meeting to give us a presentation like that, to inform us at a critical juncture when we're short on time, having to speak about the midterm budget on political ideology, he's got a serious problem at a time when there's a fiscal cliff, meaning we need to cut silos across departments. And there's also a new government that's been formed in this country that is asking questions such as, why do we need a parliamentary budget office as well as an FFC? So I'll have to jump off of this call shortly, but my strong advice to Dr. Jantjies is to seriously reconsider the function and the mandate of the PBO and what sort of time we're consuming and where we're trying to provide strategic guided input from the PBO, if that's in fact something we continue to need. A second point is that when we talk about a human rights-based approach to budget, I'm just confounded by that. It's like there should be a human rights-based approach to life for all of us. But my word, no serious financial person starts a sentence with a human rights-based approach to budgeting. It's such a nebulous term that it could be used for any political agenda. So I don't know how to put this differently except to say that please stick to the mandate of the PBO. Please do not subject us to political ideology when we've not been asked to do so. And let's just be clear on what these forums are meant to be used for. That's all from my side. Thank you, Chair.
Let me ask some questions that constructively look at post the presentation. There is enough thinking around the transition of the SRD to becoming a basic income grant. I'd like to understand if the PBO has a view about what that would mean fiscally over a long period of time. Given high debt levels and where our bonds are being sold, I'm interested in the comment that was made in the presentation to say the Reserve Bank can purchase some of our bonds, and that historically was done. I don't need a a verbal response here, but I'd like to get a note on that particular process and how it was undertaken, given the fact that going into spending in the next budget cycle will be a question about not only debt to GDP, but debt servicing costs. And there's a view that says that we will increase the ceiling on debt coming into this MTBPS, but then the question becomes the servicing of that debt, whether there are other alternatives in terms of that. And there's another school of thought that asks the question about quantitative easing. There's another school of thought that looks at what the PIC could be doing in this regard. So I'd like to hear just a broad view on that. And maybe that leads to my third point. Part of the risk that South Africa is facing is the absence of gross capital formation. So domestic investment is fairly suppressed, and as well as international investment in this is fairly suppressed. So in terms of easing of the budget, how do we stimulate those and help? Because at this point in time, we've got a purse that's limited, that's dependent on personal taxes, etc. But we don't seem to be wanting to look at how we can give incentives for South Africans to be able to invest well within their own economy. You raised the point about geopolitical, and that's the international bit. I'm not being an ideologue when I perhaps maybe ask the question about what do we do around the BRICS Bank and whether or not there's easier capital to be able to glean from that. Most of our bonds are held in Rand, I accept. So I'm just trying to figure out how do we deal with the massive elephant in the room. We can have a discussion here all day about many things. My ultimate concern really resides itself on the massive risk, which is debt, and how we service that. Secondly, the debt as it speaks to state-owned enterprises, which I don't think were sufficiently dealt with in the presentation. And those pose a significant fiscal risk, given the fact that historically, if I'm not mistaken, the recommendations in the 2023 were from the committee in 2023. And so when we make recommendations going forward, we have to think cleverly and carefully about how we deal with SOEs going forward. You raised the point about the presidency's budget and spending. I'd be interested to figure out how much of that, especially going into the MTBPS, will be linked to effectively a bloating of cabinet, because that was one of the line items that are coming through, and that might emerge in the MTBPS in terms of the request. Some of it may pertain to deployment of troops. And then the last question I want to make is that post-COVID, we dealt with a 5 billion rands contingency reserve fund. We're going into, if you like, flood season or disaster season in the country. So I'd be interested to find out whether there's, how do we look at an increased allocation for that, and where the PBO has some recommendations in that regard, simply because it will post-COVID, you raise trends around perhaps maybe, airborne diseases just generally. And I'm trying to understand, now we come back domestically in a flood-based season, what is going to happen if the contingency reserve fund is depleted? So maybe those are my questions alongside with my colleagues. Let me allow Dr. Jantjies to respond in this regard.
Thank you so much, Chair and members, for questions. We really appreciate it. And let me probably start by saying we really welcome critical views on our work. Very important for us, because at the end of the day, we are here to support you. And our view, our approach, is really ensure that we provide evidence-based advice and analysis. And that's really what we do. And our mandate, Chair and members, are very specifically stating the Act, Money Bills Act, and macroeconomic policy as part of our advisory in Parliament. And we all know what does that macroeconomic policy mean, and it's very widely debated, discussed issues around there. But I think also we try to provide evidence-based approach in this, and whatever we provide is really based on evidence we get globally, but also in our countries, very credible institutions as well. I want to stop there and respond to some of the concerns by Honorable Beck. But as I said before, Chair, members, we are happy, we are willing to meet members to engage further on some of the issues. Only time in our office, we are open for that discussions, and we, as I say, we appreciate the inputs in this regard. Which another brings me to a point. We're not criticizing the National Treasury. We are saying the fiscal policy strategy was adopted over the past 15 years. There's evidence that shows that we have not grown the economy. But firstly, we have not dealt with the debt that the strategy meant to do. And if you remember, chair members, last month or a month ago, the National Treasury actually published a report which actually shows that they have not realized it, which by itself, National Treasury admit that it has not been able to achieve that. We have not reached growth as the strategy was meant to. We have not stabilized debt. We've not, the unemployment has worsened, poverty has worsened, inequality has not improved. So this is not something we take from the air. It's an evidence base. It is stated. Last week, in our discussions, we've shown a lot of evidence that shows how far. And that has not to mean there hasn't been progress in delivery services. Hence, we emphasize the importance of protecting services, basic services, and ensuring supporting household, but also emphasizing the importance of investing in the economy. Because one of the things that in our previous presentation, we've shown, Chair, that around the period of 2023, 2028, 2027, 2003, 2007, we've seen a huge growth, an average growth of 4.5% in our economy. And yes, there was a boom in the minerals markets, but also largely we've seen that time government consumption was growing around 4.5, about 4.5% annually. We've seen investment grow around 15% on average around the same time. And we've seen even public corporation investments growing, and we've created close to 3 million jobs. We've seen investment in infrastructure and so on. And that's really one member was saying, what's an alternative? Alternative is precisely that. We've seen this actually trend happening before, where we grew the economy, we created employment, we created tax base that's good. And we're not saying, again, we're not speaking out of abstract. We're saying there is a clear strategy that's worked over those periods where we've seen a lot of growth taking place in the economy. And we've seen we've reversed that strategy, and we've seen the worst outcomes in those. Our consumption is very, very low. Our government consumption is very low. Our investment is way below the NDP targets that we've set ourselves, and we've not created employment. And that's really in a context of how we advise you in this regard. We're concerned about corruption. We're concerned about fiscal discipline, as members are saying. And I think there are specialized agencies that deal with those issues. It doesn't mean if you don't have them in our presentation, we're not concerned or concerned. We've phrased it before. We're concerned about poor governance. But we've got NPA, we've got AGS, we've got some of the specialized entities that deals with those issues in particular. But that's mean we are not concerned. We are concerned with those as well. But one of the quick things I want to address, I think, Chair, we're not saying there's underspending. Let's clarify. We're saying there's a slow spending, or there's quicker, faster spending in those areas. So because we're still in the year, we can't say there's underspending because the year is still running through. So we're trying to emphasize that we must be alert of those entities, those votes, that we don't end up running, but also look at the numbers as well. So that's want to clarify that, because I saw that caught many members' attention. We're not saying there's underspending, because we can't have underspending during the year, just that we see faster spending and slow spending in some of the areas which we want to bring to members' attentions at the stage. So that's very important to highlight that. Another point I wanted to also quickly highlight is around the issue of asylum seekers. I think it's also a very important issue. When I comment, look, I think we're concerned about illegal immigrants that impacts the budget allocation, because you are not able to account for those. But I think in terms of the register of recognized asylum seekers, South Africa has sign up international conventions where there are responsibilities that we have once we have asylum seekers. But what the committee has to definitely do is raise the concerns about accounting for illegal immigrants in this country, whom if we're not accounting for them, the budget will not cover them when they get allocated in that regard. So I'll stop there with these broadly policy issues, and I'll come in later when the team has addressed some specific questions. Siraj, do you want to start? And just like that. And please, Chair, give us a bit of time to solve some of the questions, but we'll avoid really venturing into back and forth debate with members on some of these key issues. Thank you so much, Chair.
And if I can request, there's a lot of questions, so we need to really deal with where we go, especially in the next 2 weeks, because that informs the response of this committee and certainly the recommendations that will go from there. Thank you, Siraj.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Honorable Chair. Thank you, Director. I think the main question, given the time and that's come up, is sort of how do we support growth and employment, and how do we deal with the problems of debt, particularly the strain that the levels of government debt have on the economy. So just to start off with, I think what we're trying to point out when responding to the National Treasury's documents, and we've seen these elements over and over within the budget reviews and the medium-term budget policy statements, is that there's an inadequate dealing with major elephants in the room. On the demand side, we don't think that they adequately take into account and understanding the huge impacts that poverty, but also increased and very, very large, what the developer of the Palmer ratio, Gabriel Palmer, calls obscene inequality. As a classification, he uses it for countries with a Palmer ratio of more than 4. South Africa has, and the IMF has produced work showing that inequality is a major constraint on economic growth and through causing instability. And so our definitions of what is stable and what is unstable is a problem. The other point that we made in our presentation is that on the demand side, it's really important to understand that households are 60% of expenditure that contributes to GDP. Now, we do need more spending on investment, but over the short and medium term, this is where we actually should anticipate our growth to come from. And the growth in household expenditure will actually be an incentive for the private sector to invest and to employ people to meet those demands. And that's really important to understand. So we feel that on the demand side, the levels of poverty, the lack of buying power, the cost of living crisis are really important economic conditions that aren't actually adequately taken into account in the macroeconomic analysis that informs the fiscal policy statement. On the supply side, as we show that there are deep structural problems in the economy, and again, the IMF has produced a paper in 2020, they've got a working paper that associates the high levels of concentration. And just to say that the Competition Commission looks at this all the time. They've shown that in South Africa, the levels of concentration in every economic sector of the economy is over 2,500 using the Hirschman-Herfindahl index. Over 2,500 is seen as extreme concentration in an economy. South Africa has that. We've had that for a very long time. But what we've seen, there's a study from the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at UJ, is that they've shown that the investments of the top 100 corporations on the by market capitalization on the JSE, a lot of it has been outward, a lot of it has been on maintenance and replacement of equipment, but not in expansion within South Africa. Another part of the problem is that a lot of this, there hasn't been investment into building the productive side of the economy. The SARS has pointed out that we've got there was over the last period, over 800 billion of taxes were not collected. There's a huge level of base erosion and profit shifting, capital flight linked to, I think, this high levels of concentration. So not only are the investments going abroad and into things like mergers and acquisitions, increased purchases of financial and liquid assets rather than productive long-term investments, we're seeing this problem on the supply side. So what's needed, in addition to building household ability and poor households' abilities to purchase more and increasing their buying power, is on the supply side, is to look at how we actually support growth through industrial policy and other interventions which have worked across the world, including in the developed countries in the post-Second World War period, and then the Asian tigers, the Celtic tiger experience, etc., from the 1980s onwards, is that we look at how we actually support and allocate capital, both from the private sector but also the public sector, towards creating a growing manufacturing base and industrial base in South Africa. And through this process of increasing GDP, one is starting with household consumption, rebuilding the resilience of households, and then supporting that through meeting the demand for goods from the manufacturing side. We actually, I think, will see increased GDP growth that then decreases the debt to GDP level. So the question of using fiscal consolidation to decrease debt has been shown to be a problem. In previous presentations, I can't remember if we did an induction, but to previous parliaments, we've actually put up quotes from mainstream economists in the IMF, people on advising the US presidency, etc., that shows that fiscal consolidation has been associated with long-term permanent reductions in growth. And all you're left with then is a lower GDP that actually pushes up your debt to GDP ratio. And we think that this has been the problem, part of the problem with fiscal consolidation in South Africa. I think it's really important to understand that the theoretical and empirical basis for fiscal consolidation is also weak, and it's been challenged, and the empirical evidence has been challenged, for instance, by the IMF. It really needs to be reconsidered whether this is the type of option we want to use to promote bringing our debt down, and also that's going to increase growth. And I think the experience and the evidence shows that that's not going to happen. So I think for a country like South Africa, with our huge needs, we really need to think about GDP growth as the main way in which we bring down debt to GDP levels, and then we need to think about what is going to make GDP grow from both the demand side and the supply side, and the interaction between the demand and supply side. And we're feeling that that kind of approach is not adequate within the National Treasury's views on macroeconomics. It's, I think, too biased to the supply side. I've taken a lot of time. If there are any other questions, I can either come back to them or contribute to them in writing later. Thank you, Honourable Chair. Director.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Lilia, come in.
Okay, thank you. I will start with Honourable Musima Mani's question about the contingency reserve. We also have a disaster management conditional grant that also provides funding for floods and disasters. So it's not actually the contingency reserve that's the only funding that's available for disasters. And even last year, with the contingency reserve, normally in previous years, the entire contingency reserve was allocated during the adjustments budget. But last year was different. They didn't even allocate the entire contingency reserve in the adjustments budget last year. So we will see now the proportion of the contingency that they will allocate this year. Historically, if you go back, you will see that the contingency reserve always actually funded the ICS improvements in terms of the compensation of employees' budgets. In terms of corruption, the director actually spoke to this, but we don't really directly look into corruption. But you will find we will also always emphasize inefficiencies. Even the minister will always emphasize inefficiencies. So what makes it difficult to actually isolate or determine the inefficiencies is when you try and calculate efficiencies is the lack of data. It's very difficult if you have the expenditure data, but you don't have the proper or the credible data in terms of the performance information. So if you had proper performance information, you could do this correlation and to basically determine how many houses did the Western Cape build with their total budget, and try and compare it with other provinces, for example, and then you can pick up inefficiencies very easily if you had all that information. So in terms of, we also mentioned that Treasury make changes on the budget in terms of their reviews. Perhaps they have more information that we don't have access to determine those inefficiencies and to do their reviews. But what we often see is that those reviews don't really inform the changes, because we know that we don't create jobs, but we continue funding employment programs and skills development programs. We don't see changes in that. Even last year in the budget, a huge amount of the budget was moved to the IDC for job creation programs. And I think that is also where the question came from to the Treasury, that they must provide the committee with all their programs and all their funds. In last year, we also did a evaluation or assessment in terms of all the funds and job creation programs that we could actually isolate in the budget. It's a huge amount, and we don't really have our fingers on it or our thumbs on it to really determine how much money we spend on that. Should we not rather reprioritize those funds to education? Because the Minister of Finance actually indicated we have a problem in education. Our matrics are not employable. That's why we need all these job creation or employment programs to make them employable. And then in terms of the conditional grants, members, the diagram that we've got, sorry, I must just get to this to the slide, was only the in-kind grants. So these are not the grants that are transferred to the departments itself to spend. It's the grants that are actually administered or spent from the national departments itself. So you will see we will continue with all those grants, and we continue the underspending specifically on the ones that are allocated or spent in municipal areas. But what the question is, why don't we spend that money? Isn't it that there's already a lot of other grants that are allocated towards that funds? That's why the national department can't spend it. We don't know. We need to analyze that and make sure that we know why that money is not spent. Most of the answers that we get is the tender processes and all those procurement issues. But it might be because the grants that are already transferred to the municipalities might be enough. We don't know, but it's not enough because we know this. We have a problem with infrastructure, for example. Conditional, I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. There's only one thing, perhaps it's not totally relevant to this discussion that we have. One of the members indicated about the asylum seekers and the pressure on conditional grants, but it's not just the pressure on the conditional grants. Members, I don't know if you also use Checker 6060 and Woolworths Dash and all those things. We've created a few jobs in terms of that service that we're now using or has been established by big businesses. But you won't believe the number of those motorbike drivers that end up in our health system. And it's not because of a broken finger, it's because of broken femurs, and they need operations. It's not just putting a plaster on the accidents and the injuries that they get. So there's a huge burden on our health system as well in terms of that. And most of those motorbike drivers are actually foreigners. They're not South Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. Tsepo, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Dr. DJ. Thank you, Chairperson. Yeah, I wanted to say something about the issue around growing economy. I think that growing the South African economy alone, and when I say growing the economy, meaning focusing on GDP alone, will not be sufficient to address the challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, given some of the structural challenges that Siraj spoke about earlier around concentration, financialization, etc. So I do think that the current path that we're currently on will not be able to include majority of South Africans who are largely poor and unskilled and are unable to participate in the economy. So therefore, I think the objectives should be rather economic development rather than economic growth. Because when you speak about economic development, it also includes a broader sort of improvement in terms of living standards. It speaks about the reductions in poverty, unemployment, and inequality. It also speaks to improvements as it relates to health and education and environmental sustainability. There was a question around I think the question was around why don't we take money away from departments that spend their budgets. I think cutting the budget is not a solution. Especially even if the reasons are underspending or corruption, that does not necessarily mean that the service delivery need does not exist. It still remains. Children still need schools. There's still a need for the provision of public services. We still need doctors, etc. So we can't simply punish the population for poor state capacity. I do think that the focus should rather be on how do we build state capacity to spend, including taking a hard stance on corruption and maladministration. Then there was a question by the chair around the BRICS Bank as an alternative to finance. Interesting that you raised that within the global discourse, there's a current global discussion about the need to review the current international financial architecture and whether or not there's a need for alternatives. I think that certainly, given the reality that South Africa is a part of BRICS, the same way we are part of the IMF, we should be able to take advantage of cheaper financing that's been offered by BRICS Bank and to diversify our debt profile as much as possible. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, President Tsepo. Busi, coming. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the questions. I think I'll just broadly touch on tax, but to begin with, to add on to what Nita was talking about in terms of disaster management. What we've raised in the past is that we actually have a significant backlog in those areas that are continuously affected by disasters. And so when we think about the contingency reserve as a way of responding to immediate disasters, it's also a need to look at what is needed to build resilience in those communities to begin with. So for example, in KZN, we see the areas that are affected, like the houses that are affected. We have to think about how do we build resilient houses, physical houses, so that we mitigate future risks around disasters. So I think it's a two-way thing, to think about the immediate responses, but to also contextualize it in a sense that there's been multiple disasters and there remains a significant backlog. So financing for disaster, has to be backward-looking and forward-looking in that particular way. In terms of tax, there was a question around how to think about personal income taxes. In the PBO in the past, we've spoken about taxing wealth, and income derived from wealth isn't something to think about. We've also put forward that there's a need for a systematic review of tax incentives and to do away with tax incentives that are not working, because that's revenue that's foregone, that's not doing what it's supposed to do. For example, we've spoken in the past about the employment tax incentive and how there actually hasn't been evidence, or National Treasury hasn't produced evidence to show that it actually does create new jobs. And so the question is, could we be spending that money or use that money for something else? That foregone tax could be used for something else. We've also spoken about diversifying tax tools. So for example, having excess profits taxes on companies that basically use inflation upsurges to profit for their own profit. We've also talked about windfall taxes, especially we've just come out of a commodity, a favorable price commodities time, and thinking about windfall taxes, which is not a new idea. In fact, you know, windfall taxes have been discussed in South Africa as early as I know, 2012. So not necessarily a new idea. And we've also spoken about tackling illicit financial flows as a significant way of increasing revenue on that front. So it's the alternatives, you know, we put forward some alternatives into thinking about our tax base and so forth. It's just about, you know, the appetite to explore those alternatives fundamentally. And I think lastly, to just talk about the foster grant question, as we've already mentioned, we don't know the real reason why the number of beneficiaries are declining. And I think that's a question to ask to DSD to say, you know, are there less people applying for foster grants, or what is actually happening in that system, and something to really be aware of. And as I mentioned, this has been systematically going on for a couple of years now. So maybe there's bigger and broader issues around access, application, and so forth that need to be explored. And then lastly, on the SRD, I think, you know, in terms of what the costing looks like in the long term, we don't have the actual numbers of what it would cost, but I think really to say what is missing and what National Treasury hasn't produced is actually what, besides the fact that it's obviously a constitutional right, social assistance is a right, but to also say National Treasury hasn't been able to produce to us the impacts, right? So we don't have a paper out of government that says this is how the SRD has impacted the economy, including the returns back to the fiscus, right? Because of course, when people get the grant itself, part of it is going to be self-financing because people are going to spend it, and part of that VAT that they use is going to come back to the fiscus in a particular way. So we actually don't have a large-scale study, and of course, other institutions have done this work, but you know, we should have at this point enough evidence, given how long it's been implemented, to actually show this. You know, even the child support grant, we don't have the large-scale studies, but we have some evidence that shows that the child grant impacts households in particular ways. For example, mothers who receive grants on behalf of their children are 15% more likely to be employed because they're able to use that money to send their children to creche and look for jobs and so forth. So it's also thinking about the costing in a different way. And I don't think at this point we've been provided adequate, at least at a government national level, the evidence to actually adequately cost it in that particular way. So I think I'll end there. I think the rest of the other questions have been covered. Thank you very much.
Mukundi, do you have anything to add? I think you also came in. Mukundi?
Prof, I know there are many different responses, but I'd like us to keep us. So let's just, if we need to bring it to a wrap.
All right. Can I just summarize some of the, I saw some of the few points that were left out. I think what we'll do, Chair, what we can do also with your guidance and the members, we can respond to specific points in writing as part of going forward in building up towards the session. Few points I wanted to also touch on, which I think we left out. Thanks to Busiwas. What we have said before about the SRD and income grant support, what we have said, we did say that it should not be seen as a separate isolation of social waste, but it should be seen as part of economic policy. Because when you provide the support, you actually improving demand in the economy, you know, and a lot of times demand in the economy, as Bruce is saying, as a way of supporting public finances positions itself. So that really, the debate in our view, it has to really take that into account. It has to be seen as part of economic policy as much as part of social policy. The SOEs we're having concern about, and I think in the previous presentation, we did say that actually there's a need to review some of these state-owned entities, given that particularly around the governance framework structures, and but a lot to make sure that many of these SOEs are helping us to deal with developmental outcomes that we're set out for, and many probably are not, and maybe there's a need to actually think about rationing some of them and maybe having more that are more towards where we are as an economy. So there's definitely a need to review some of these, but I think focusing a lot on what has been done. So the evidence does show that we have not invested a lot in some of these SOEs, hence they're failing us today. When we look at Transnet, we look at ESCOM, we know we failed to invest earlier than when we were science, and now we see we have to see, lose so much money investing there now, or trying to put the plasters in some of the more structural changes we have in that regard. I think the question around asylum seekers, I still feel like we need to have maybe a study where we can also advise the committee really broadly to say what are some of the issues around that and how it impacts on the budget broadly. Because at the same time, I'm quite careful that we shouldn't deal with it without having a very strong study in that regard. So we'll consider it in going forward, what study can we do around asylum seekers, its impact on the budget. The issue of policy positioning going forward, Chair, I think the message that we're trying to emphasize is that let us use all the policy tools that we have to try and let's put everything, let's put the whole sink into the whole thing, including monetary policy, including both monetary policy and fiscal policy, because what we have argued and shown in literature that, but also over time, is that we have seen credit being expensive when we compare ourselves with other countries. Our credit extension has been largely over long-term credit, long-term interest rate, and short-term has been largely expensive compared to other countries, making it more expensive to invest in the economy. So if we think about how we grow the economy, that the role of the monetary policy would come quite handy as well, largely because the macroeconomic policy covers all these objectives: employment, growth, price stability, and it shouldn't be that one objective macroeconomic policy take precedence over the other. So you should look at it as a whole. And as in Rebecca message, what investment in supporting businesses to invest, and that one of them is ensuring that there's a better credit extension for business and household. And that means ensuring that our monetary policy are supportive broadly. Let's answer the question around being developmental. Chair, I'll stop there, and I think what we'll do, we'll ask the committee secretary colleagues to send specific questions that we want to build on, but also we'll probably wait for the presentation of the MTBPS and build on those points as part of the post-assessment of the policy statement, largely. My parting point, Chair, is around ensuring that it has to be clearly indicated what this midterm budget policy is based on if we don't have a midterm development plan. Thank you so much, Chair and members.
Thank you so much to the PBO. I think it's a fairly comprehensive presentation, and I want to thank all the presenters, because I think it gives us a full, both on monetary and fiscal policy. I do want to say, in reflection back to some of the inputs committee-wise, is that our terrain is not even, we give oversight. There is in December a national dialogue, which I would presume will locate itself on questions of what are the priorities of the 7th administration? And emanating from those priorities, you can glean ideological inference. That's not the terrain of this particular committee. And our job is to provide oversight, and our job is to partner with the PBO in being able to give the appropriate tools of analysis that give us a view into the budget, so that when we make inputs, we can be able to make the appropriate adjustment. Dr. Jantjies and Prof. Siraj, I'm going to appeal to both of you, and I will write this note personally. In terms of looking at, you made a slide that speaks about where are the points of adjustments. I do think I'm concerned deeply about investment in infrastructure. I'm concerned deeply about questions of debt, and I did raise that particular question about government bonds and purchasing thereof. And I think we need to have a discussion about those, because that will consume a significant component, not only just of the growth initiatives that we've got to look at, but also the sense upon which there's fiscal sustainability over a long period of time. So those are the dual conversations I'd like to have. With that in mind, let me thank you and thank honorable members. We will engage post facto in this regard. May I ask, just in the light of that, honorable members, I had post our meeting, if I can close this particular discussion, post our meeting on Wednesday, we discuss respective role allocations as to what members can look at in areas of specificity. Some members made certain requests in terms of where they have primary interests. We've tried our best to balance it out in terms of where members go. I've been in consultation with the chair of finance. That is a conversation that is ongoing, but I have a draft proposal to which I'll ask the committee secretariat to circulate to members. But broadly speaking, we thought it may be helpful as we look at, just if I can, just in 30 seconds, to look at in learning and culture for Honorable Berg, to look into that, in health, Honorable Neil May, to have a look into those, in social development as a function, Honorable Kalega Mazibugo, if you can have a look into that. In terms of community development spend, and if Honorable Bartlett, we can have a look at that. Economic development, if Honorable Kanyani can look at that. In the peace and security function, Honorable Douglas. And then in general public services, I thought Honorable Hlonyani could look into that. And then Honorable Kwankwa, in terms of payment and for financial assets, all of those lines spend, if we can have a look at those, and then I'll do my best to plug in where members can't. But we will circulate that, and that will give you a sense of where the budget sits in its broader sense, emanating from last year's. I know, Honorable Douglas, you weren't part of the discussion on Wednesday, but I thought, let me just, I will send you that in that note, if that's okay with you. With that in mind, Honorable Members.
Hi, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. All good.
May I propose that, having dealt with both the PBO's presentation and where we go, I want to thank you all for this morning. We will obviously convene next week. We have a session on Tuesday, and then, of course, the lock-up session starting on Wednesday, and then the briefing by the Minister on Thursday. That's okay. Look forward to seeing you next week. With that, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Long live the chair. Long live the PBO.
Recording stopped.
Thank you. Thank you.